or whether her eyes had deceived her. "Yes," cried Frank, looking a little closer. "Small clothes, certainly, and rough grey stockings too. Do you know him, ma'am?" "Kate, my dear," said Mrs. Nickleby, deliberately sitting herself down in a chair with that sort of desperate resignation which seemed to imply that now matters had come to a crisis, and all disguise was useless, "you will have the goodness, my love, to explain precisely how this matter stands. I have given him no encouragement, none whatever, not the least in the world. You know that, my dear, perfectly well. He was very respectful, exceedingly respectful, when he declared, as you were a witness to. Still, at the same time, if I am to be persecuted in this way, if vegetable what's-his-names and all kinds of garden stuff are to strew my path out of doors, and gentlemen are to come choking up our chimneys at home, I really don't know, upon my word I do NOT know what is to become of me. It's a very hard case, harder than anything I was ever exposed to before I married your poor dear papa, though I suffered a good deal of annoyance then, but that, of course, I expected and made up my mind for. When I was not nearly so old as you, my dear, there was a young gentleman who sat next to us at church, who used, almost every Sunday, to cut my name in large letters in the front of his pew while the sermon was going on. It was gratifying, of course, naturally so, but still it was an annoyance, because the pew was in a very conspicuous place, and he was several times publicly taken out by the beadle for doing it. But that was nothing to this. This is a great deal worse, and a great deal more embarrassing. I would rather, Kate, my dear,' said Mrs. Nickleby, with great solemnity, and an effusion of tears, 'I would rather, I declare, have been a pig-faced lady than be exposed to such a life as this.' Frank Cheeryble and Tim Linkinwater looked, in irrepressible astonishment, first at each other, and then at Kate, who felt that some explanation was necessary, but who, between her terror at the apparition of the legs, her fear lest their owner should be smothered, and her anxiety to give the least ridiculous solution of the mystery that it was capable of bearing, was quite unable to utter a single word. 'He gives me great pain,' continued Mrs. Nickleby, drying her eyes, 'great pain. But don't hurt a hair of his head, I beg. On no account hurt a hair of his head.' It would not, under existing circumstances, have been quite so easy to hurt a hair of the gentleman's head as Mrs. Nickleby seemed to imagine, inasmuch as that part of his person was some feet up the chimney, which was by no means a wide one. But as all this time he had never left off singing about the bankruptcy of the beautiful maid in respect of truth, and now began not only to croak very feebly, but to kick with great violence, as if respiration became a task of difficulty, Frank Cheeryble, without further hesitation, pulled at the shorts and worsted with such heartiness as to bring him floundering into the room, with greater precipitation than he had quite calculated upon. 'Oh yes, yes,' said Kate, directly the whole figure of this singular visitor appeared in this abrupt manner. 'I know who it is. Pray don't be rough with him. Is he hurt? I hope not. Oh, pray see if he is hurt.' 'He is not, I assure you,' replied Frank, handling the object of his surprise after this appeal, with sudden tenderness and respect. 'He is not hurt in the least.' 'Don't let him come any nearer,' said Kate, retiring as far as she could. 'Oh no, he shall not,' rejoined Frank. 'You see I have him secure here. But may I ask you what this means, and whether you expected this old gentleman?' 'Oh no,' said Kate, 'of course not. But Mama does not think so, I believe, but he is a mad gentleman who has escaped from the next house, and must have found an opportunity of secreting himself here.' 'Kate,' interposed Mrs. Nickleby, with severe dignity, 'I am surprised at you.' 'Dear mama,' Kate gently remonstrated. 'I am surprised at you,' repeated Mrs. Nickleby. 'Upon my word, Kate, I am quite astonished that you should join the persecutors of this unfortunate gentleman, when you know very well that they have the basest designs upon his property, and that that is the whole secret of it. It would be much kinder of you, Kate, to ask Mr. Linkinwater or Mr. Cheeryble to interfere on his behalf, and see him righted. You ought not to allow your feelings to influence you. It's not right, very far from it. What should my feelings be, do you suppose? If anybody ought to be indignant, who is it? I, of course, and very properly so. Still, at the same time, I wouldn't commit such an injustice for the world. No,' continued Mrs. Nickleby, drawing herself up, and looking another way with a kind of bashful stateliness. 'This gentleman will understand me when I tell him that I repeat the answer I gave him the other day, that I always will repeat it, though I do believe him to be sincere when I find him placing himself in such dreadful situations on my account, and that I request him to have the goodness to go away directly. or it will be impossible to keep his behaviour a secret from my son Nicholas. I am obliged to him, very much obliged to him, but I cannot listen to his addresses for a moment. It's quite impossible.' While this address was in course of delivery, the old gentleman, with his nose and cheeks embellished with large patches of soot, sat upon the ground with his arms folded, eyeing the spectators in profound silence, and with a very majestic demeanour. He did not appear to take the smallest notice of what Mrs. Nickleby said, but when she ceased to speak he honoured her with a long stare, and inquired if she had quite finished. 'I have nothing more to say,' replied that lady modestly. 'I really cannot say anything more.' 'Very good,' said the old gentleman, raising his voice. 'Then bring in the bottled lightning, a clean tumbler, and a corkscrew.' Nobody executing this order, the old gentleman, after a short pause, raised his voice again, and demanded a thunder sandwich. This article not being forthcoming either, he requested to be served with a fricassee of boot tops and goldfish sauce, and then, laughing heartily, gratified his hearers with a very long, very loud, and most melodious bellow. But still Mrs. Nickleby, in reply to the significant looks of all about her, shook her head as though to assure them that she saw nothing whatever in all this, unless, indeed, it were a slight degree of eccentricity. She might have remained impressed with these opinions down to the latest moment of her life, but for a slight train of circumstances, which, trivial as they were, altered the whole complexion of the case. It happened that Miss La Creevy, finding her patient in no very threatening condition, and being strongly impelled by curiosity to see what was going forward, bustled into the room while the old gentleman was in the very act of bellowing. It happened, too, that the instant the old gentleman saw her, he stopped short, skipped suddenly on his feet, and fell to kissing his hand violently, a change of demeanour which almost terrified the little portrait painter out of her senses, and caused her to retreat behind Tim Linkinwater with the utmost expedition. 'Aha!' cried the old gentleman, folding his hands and squeezing them with great force against each other. 'I see her now, I see her now! My love, my life, my bride, my peerless beauty! She is come at last, and all is gas and gaiters!' Mrs. Nickleby looked rather disconcerted for a moment, but immediately recovering, nodded to Miss La Creevy and the other spectators several times, and frowned and smiled gravely, giving them to understand that she saw where the mistake was, and would set it all to rights in a minute or two. 'She is come,' said the old gentleman, laying his hand upon his heart. 'Cormoran and Blunderbore, she is come! All the wealth I have is hers, if she will take me for her slave. Where are grace, beauty, and blandishments like those? In the Empress of Madagascar? No. In the Queen of Diamonds? No. In Mrs. Rowland, who every morning bathes in Calidore for nothing? No. Melt all those down into one, with the 3 Graces, the 9 Muses, and 14 biscuit bakers' daughters from Oxford Street, and make a woman half as lovely. Pah! I defy you.' After uttering this rhapsody, the old gentleman snapped his fingers 20 or 30 times, and then subsided into an ecstatic contemplation of Miss La Creevy's charms. This affording Mrs. Nickleby a favourable opportunity of explanation, she went about it straight. 'I am sure,' said the worthy lady, with a prefatory cough, 'that it's a great relief, under such trying circumstances as these, to have anybody else mistaken for me, a very great relief, and it's a circumstance that never occurred before. Although I have several times been mistaken for my daughter Kate, I have no doubt the people were very foolish, and perhaps ought to have known better, but still they did take me for her, and of course that was no fault of mine, and it would be very hard indeed if I was to be made responsible for it. However, in this instance, of course, I must feel that I should do exceedingly wrong if I suffered anybody, especially anybody that I am under great obligations to be made uncomfortable on my account, and therefore I think it my duty to tell that gentleman that he is mistaken, that I am the lady who he was told by some impertinent person was the niece to the Council of Paving Stones, and that I do beg and entreat of him to go quietly away, if it's only for,' here Mrs. Nickleby simpered and hesitated, 'for my sake.' It might have been expected that the old gentleman would have been penetrated to the heart by the delicacy and condescension of this appeal, and that he would have at least have returned a courteous and suitable reply. What then was the shock which Mrs. Nickleby received, when accosting her in the most unmistakable manner, he replied in a loud and sonorous voice, 'Avaunt! Cat!' 'Sir!' cried Mrs. Nickleby, in a faint tone. 'Cat,' replied the old gentleman. 'Puss, kit, tit, grimal.